Hello. So let's get into Cymbeline a little bit more. And it is called the kitchen sink play. And you can imagine why that might be. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a moment. Uh, so, shall we dive in and learn a little bit more about the who, what, where, when of Cymbeline? All right, let's go. Okay, so Shakespeare uses the five-act paradigm, and it's really important to see this image and how it sort of goes because it's easier to follow along with Shakespeare's plays. And many plays use five acts, but you're going to find when we get to more contemporary plays, they abbreviate and they don't use a five-act paradigm. So it'll be fun to compare and contrast. So, high five. The five-act paradigm was created before the beginning of the Christian era. And it's a Renaissance thing because it's used in all his Shakespearean plays and in most of those of his contemporaries who were writing during the Elizabethan era, which means when Queen Elizabeth was reigning in England, or the Jacobean era, which follows Queen Elizabeth and was under King James I. And this five-act paradigm is modeled after Seneca. The main proponent of this approach was Seneca, the most famous Greek tragedian, whose plays were studied in the universities of England. And so you just want to keep that in mind as we move forward. Oops, excuse me. So when we were talking about short stories and exposition, rising action, climax, denouement, and conclusion, it's sort of similar in that you can see that you have the rising action here, and typically it's not always the case. You can't say 100% of the time, but 95% of the time, the climax transpires in the third act. And then we see the denouement and denouement. I can never pronounce that correctly. It's tomato, right? And then we get to the conclusion. And usually Act 5 is shorter and really ties everything up real quickly. So that's something to consider about Shakespeare's writing also. Okay, the kitchen sink. So, history. It's like a history because of the famous historical legendary king and sons. Notice I did not say daughter because women weren't always considered famous, historical, or legendary. But it's interesting to see how Shakespeare might be putting a twist on this and highlighting the daughter more than the sons. So romantic, it deals in verse or prose with legendary, supernatural, or amorous subjects and characters. This is interesting because the romance as a genre was out of vogue by the Renaissance, or the end of the Renaissance, 14th to 17th century. And there's more, you'll learn more about romance in the other presentation I created for you. It's happily tragical. We talked about that. Tragic comedy combines elements of the tragedy with those of comedy. You get more of that in the other presentation. And in tragedy, there's a central character called a tragic protagonist or a tragic hero who suffers some serious misfortune which is not accidental. It's usually fated, or a supernatural being or the divine intervene, and therefore it's not meaningless. There's some meaning to it, and so it's significant in that the misfortune is logically connected with the hero's actions. So there can be some sort of intervention, but typically some of the tragedy is actually caused by the tragic hero, her, him, themselves. And the other thing to consider about that is often there's a tragic flaw, and the tragic flaw is typically hubris, which is translated to mean pride, is the downfall. But there are divine interventions as well. Now, who could be our tragic hero? And I mentioned just a moment ago that Shakespeare is highlighting somebody else, and I'm going to give you a hint. Her, so is it maybe a tragic heroine rather than a tragic hero? And then that would be Shakespeare doing something a little different from most of the tragedies of his time and previously. And so you might want to consider why he chooses to do that and to highlight a female character in that way. So the play was written between 1608 and 1610. It's one of Shakespeare's final plays, and it was first printed in the first folio in 1623, where it was actually included and listed among the tragedies. So that's interesting that the first folio was compiled by the Shakespeare's acting company. A number of years. He died in 1616, so it was about 7 years after his death. And plays weren't the things, poetry were the things, or poetry was the thing, and so people didn't publish plays during this time. Take Shakespeare with me and you'll learn much more about this. But what was kind of lovely is, as a tribute, every actor just got their side, and that would be their scripts, their beginning and ending lines. They got together, put them together, and then published it. The first recorded performance was in 1611, and someone named Dr. Simon Forman jotted down a description of Cymbeline in his commonplace book for the year, like his diary or his journal. Although he did not record the actual date that he saw the play, he must have seen it sometime between April and his sudden death in September 8th, 1611, because of the entries. Often we get to, for those of you historians in the class, you know this well, we learn about people, places, and things by what other peoples and places and things have to say about the people, places, and things. Stylistically, the play appears to follow Pericles, which was written in 1606 or 1608, and to precede The Winter's Tale that was thought to be written in 1609 to 1611. So where do the stories come from? Yeah, this is fascinating. People think all of these stories originate with Shakespeare, and a lot of them do, and it doesn't detract from his creative prowess or his expertise or the depth of his imagination. But what we can think about is, if we're creative writers, where do we get our inspiration from? Do we write our own fan fiction? Do we get inspired by other stories? Do we get inspired by the histories we read? Do we get inspired by the news? Do we get inspired by tall tales that we hear from people? So there is a historical foundation. Shakespeare bases Cymbeline on an account in the Chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland. They're called Holinshed's Chronicles, by Ralph Holinshed, who began work on this history under the royal printer Reginald Wolfe. And the first edition of the Chronicles of Holinshed's Chronicles was published in 1577 in 2 volumes. Shakespeare would have been very familiar with that, and in fact, he uses the historical accounts as the basis for many of his history plays, as well as his tragedies and even some of his comedies. And it's interesting, though, he puts his own twist. It's like a reimagined history, or highlighting the things that he wants the people in his audience to grapple with, to see, to highlight, to look at. And Shakespeare also used a story in the Decameron by Boccaccio, who lived from 1313 to 1375. And it consists of 100 tales told by 7 men and 3 women to pass the time after they isolate themselves in a villa to escape the plague. So, and Shakespeare would have been exposed to an English translation of the Decameron that appeared in England in 1566 in Palace of Pleasure by William Painter. In addition, Shakespeare may have used A Mirror for Magistrates, published in 1559 by George Ferrers and William Baldwin, as a source for some of his story. This is a collaborative collection of poems in which the ghosts of eminent statespeople recount their downfalls in first-person narratives called tragedies or complaints, as an example for magistrates and others in position of power. It was published in multiple editions, was very popular, and contemporary dramatists, including Shakespeare, were inspired by its procedures for drawing lessons for the present from historical figures. Its mixing of historical narrative with a focus on the individual, and its mixing of Christian rhetoric with tropes from classical tragedy become fodder for Shakespeare's imagination, and as I said, a sort of way for him to mirror and to reflect and to highlight for his audience how he might see them and how he might want to see them. So look, you can extrapolate a lot from the play with keeping some of these things in mind. Just as an extra side note, if you're interested, the poem is written in rhyme royale, a verse form introduced by Chaucer and popular in the late Middle Ages, but was slightly dated by the Elizabethan period when Shakespeare lived and wrote. But interestingly, Shakespeare uses this form in his narrative poem, The Rape of Lucrece, or Lucrece. Tomato, tomato. Then, King Cymbeline is known to history as Cunobellinus. That's a tongue twister. Cunobellinus. I'm putting the emphasis on the wrong syllable. Cunobellinus. There we go. Yay. Who ruled over southern eastern Britain from 10 AD to 41 AD from his capital in Colchester, then known as Cumulatinum. There we go. On the Colne River. And curiously, for whatever it's worth, the pronunciation of the first 7 letters of Cumulatinum, Cumulad, sounds not unlike the legendary name for King Arthur's residence, Camelot. The Roman historian Suetonius referred to Cunobellinus as the king of all the Britons, and during his reign, Cunobellinus kept Roman advancement at bay, forging treaties with emperors Augustus Caesar and Tiberius. In an invasion attempt by forces of the demented Emperor Caligula came to naught in 40 AD. However, Romans under Emperor Claudius I captured Cumulin, you know what I mean, in 43 BC and ruled it as the first Roman colony in Britain. I want to give you some of this historical background. Some of you are history buffs, but also it gives you a little bit of insight into Shakespeare's character and allows you to see what twist he might be putting on the characters, on the histories, on the other stories, in order to make whatever argument he's trying to make and what he wants to reflect and show. And then we can also see how much of what he's bringing forward relates to us today. So, are we there yet? The action takes place in ancient England, Wales, setting the scene, and in Rome in the age when the forces of imperial Rome invaded and occupied Britain, probably between 10 and 14 AD. Specific locales include Cymbeline's palace in England, see the picture, perhaps in the vicinity of present-day city of Colchester, which is northeast of London and south of Ipswich, in the county of Essex along the North Sea coastline. A house in Rome, a cave in the mountains of Wales, the port of Milford Haven in southwest Wales, a Roman military encampment in Britain, and a field of battle in Britain. So that kind of helps you see where you're going to be throughout the course of the play. Again, I mentioned it in the other video, but Shakespeare breaks the unities of time and place, and we have multiple settings when typically it's one or two. And I've mentioned this before, and I'll mention again, there's very much a fairy tale-like quality to the play that also helps the play to transcend time and place. And I'm wondering if that has any impact on our ability to see ourselves in any of the action or the character or the plays. So please keep that in mind as you go too. So one of these things is just like the other. It's Snow White. We've mentioned similarities in the other presentation. We've got a wicked queen. We've got a jealous of the stepdaughter, sends her hireling to kill the girl in the woods. Tricks the hireling to give girl poison, but the man cannot do the deed. Girl runs off into the woods and finds a cave where 2 or 3 men, 2 of them her long exiled brothers, but she doesn't know that yet, live. Oops, spoiler alert, sorry. One of the first studies of Snow White, I'm not going to be able to pronounce these names perfectly, but I'm going to do my best, so please bear with me, is Karl Schenkel's Das Märchen von Sneewittchen und Shakespeare's Cymbeline. I didn't butcher it too badly, right? It was published in Germania in 1864, and it traces the parallels between that folktale and Shakespeare's play. We also have Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm's version of Snow White, and you can see when they lived and died respectively. And can you think of any other fairy tales that this might fit? You might think of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. There's eating and stealing food in the house. And then any modern fairy tales? I've had one student share with me, and I was so excited when she did, Shrek. And so you might want to think about any parallels with Shrek, or if there's a modern take on it that we can see in Shrek. So, something that might be confusing about this play is that there are many stories within the story. We have an overall plot line, but then we have lots of other little plots happening along the way. And so it's good for us to get a grip of it and be able to follow along and see when we're shifting from each. So we have the war between Italy and Britain. We've got the love affair with Imogen and Posthumus. We have the Iachimo seduction that comes from the Decameron. We have the action that's happening in the Welsh wilderness. We've got the Queen's deceit, and then we've got Cloten's revenge. So this is all happening within. No wonder the play is called the kitchen sink play, right? We've got so much happening in it, but it's such a fun play, and I hope you're going to enjoy it. I just want to share with you a few definitions to give you an idea of how precise and purposeful Shakespeare is when he chooses the names for his characters. They often have more meaning, and so here are just a few names for you to think about, and think about how the names relate to the characters or do not relate to the characters or even to the plot. And so I want you to just keep that in mind. Mythology madness. There are so many references to so many mythological characters. Shakespeare loves mythology. You'll find it in each of his plays. Has a big role, lots of meaning, and sometimes more and sometimes less references, or more or fewer references. For this, there's lots. Why? Why might that be? Well, it emphasizes a time pre-Christian worship, enables more of the fantasy element, also allows for pagan customs, and here's a quotation for you as well. So what that's sort of, and I'm just going to give you a real quick list that you can look at of the different people. But this is important. Remember, when in the other presentation, I'll say what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, right? Often it's easier when Shakespeare is writing a play and he's using art as a sort of treatise of revolution, or an attempt at change, or maybe even a criticism of the reigning monarchy or the gentried landowners and people of title. It could put him in a very precarious position. He doesn't have freedom of speech like we do in America. And so if he sets his plays in different time periods and also in different countries, it gives him more latitude to provide any criticism or social commentary without being censured in the same way or being held accountable. But also think about, why might he want to emphasize a pre-Christian time? Why might he want to bring in a place for pagan customs? What could be the goal and purpose and meaning of that? So this isn't interesting. We can see there's a lot of conflict in the play. There's a lot of paradox. There's dichotomy. There's juxtaposition. But also, I'm wondering, if we look at it, there's sort of a war, right? War of love, war of the sexes. You might throw in gender, war of the countries, war of women, war of generations, war of worlds. There's conflict, right? And I don't know if it always is elevated to a sense of war of the classes, war of the words, war between nature and nurture, war between slander and truth. But at the very least, we can see that this is where a lot of the conflict lies. And if you look for some of these things and answer some of the questions here on this slide, you might find that you'll have a lot of things to consider and think about and to tease out of the play to make meaning. For Green and Court, this is important. This is something that Northrop Frye also says and has sort of coined, that in Shakespeare you'll find he has a green world and a court world, and they are often two sides of the same coin, or they're kind of foils for each other, or they kind of are at odds with one another. So a court world is very much like modern society, contemporary society. There are rules, there are regulations, there's society, regulations and rules, there's actual laws that need to be followed, propriety, all sorts of things that sort of confine and restrict. In the green world, that's in nature. And in nature, you've got freedom. You've got freedom of expression. You're more connected to nature. You are able to behave more naturally. There aren't the same sort of rules that confine sort of anything goes, because everything's natural. And so there's something pretty profound about this, because Shakespeare, growing up in Stratford upon Avon, very much grew up in a rural area with all sorts of nature, and he loves his flowers. There's all sorts of flowers in all of Shakespeare, and the symbolism. There's a lot of birds. And so he's very connected to nature, and he often makes a lot of arguments about the power and the need for nature and the beauty in nature. So something to keep in mind and to think about. All right, that's it. Happily ever after to you. And I hope you enjoy the